Welcome to another edition of the Writer's Craft here on Sparks 1524. I'm Nathaniel Miller. I'm currently rewriting the fourth draft. I'm currently rewriting the draft of my fourth novel, Lionfish. Now, I started writing the Accidental Detective series back in 2017. That was 5 years ago. And in 5 years, I had 4 novels drafted, 3 of which are published: Proud Lion, The Norfolk Murders, and So It Begins. When Jerry, of course, is my deadly enemy. My editor and my friend. When we started working on And So It Begins together, 2/3 of that book I had rewritten because my skill sets improved. 1/3 was the original draft, which I brought forward. That 1/3 is what drove us up the wall. So I told Jerry when it's time to do Lionfish, I'm just rewriting it from scratch. It's the same story, but I can execute it so much better and save us time in the editing process. Lionfish is handing me a challenge that I did not see coming, but actually makes perfect sense in light of the fact that real life does this to us. Every relationship we have in the real world, friendships, professional relationships, marriages, whatever, are partially built on and defined by the social constructs and barriers and realities around us. Jerry and I, one reason we have so much fun with talking about being the best of enemies and mortal friends is because we were both active duty sailors. In fact, he was my boss at one point. And later I made Chief Petty Officer and kind of caught up with him, and we became friends and peers and moved on. But we always had a very combative type of relationship, which is very common in the military. And so even in civilian life, we still retain a little of that combativeness. But our relationship has significantly changed now that we're both out of uniform, because we don't have to worry about the constraints of the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, military law. We don't have to worry about the constraints of the rank structure. And as we were both public affairs specialists at the end of our careers, we also used to have to worry about saying or doing something, especially in uniform, that might reflect on the Navy. Well, we don't have to anymore. We have both adjusted to that relationship, and it's been pretty decent. I mean, we're both very self-aware men, but there have been a few points where we went, and that was because we're trying to negotiate a whole new landscape using a map from the last landscape. That's real life. We all go through it. Well, our characters are going to go through it too, and it didn't occur to me that they go through it until I'm in the middle of Lionfish. The first 3 novels of the Accidental Detective series, Proud Lion, Norfolk Murders, and So It Begins, show the relationship between my primary protagonist, Isaac Shepard, the accidental detective, and his partner, NCIS Special Agent Abraham Gray, but all during Isaac's active duty career. Now, And So It Begins, novel number 3, starts in 2018 after Isaac is retired, but that's a framing device as he's relating his very first adventure in 1999, which is where he meets Gray. So their whole friendship, the whole premise of their working relationship even, is that Isaac is an active duty sailor in uniform with all those considerations. Abraham Gray is a federal officer with all those considerations. Plus, for most of their relationship, Gray was kind of the older brother, the mentor to the slightly volatile and unstable Isaac Shepard as he grew up. Then we get to Lionfish. This is where the change happens. Well, in Lionfish, which takes place a year after Isaac retires, he and Gray finally end up partnering together on another case, but that's where the challenge is. Their whole relationship dynamic has changed. Gray is still an NCIS agent, but Isaac Shepard is a free agent. He's a civilian. He's not constrained by the UCMJ. He's not constrained by worrying about what might happen if he reflects badly on the Navy, since he's also a public affairs specialist. The entire dynamic of their friendship has altered because life alters the dynamics of our real life friendships. And I kept running into a situation with Lionfish as I'm working on the rewrite. I said, same story, just a completely different working of it. That I'd write a scene and it just was wrong. Something was off. And I'd step back, but the scene worked. The story itself was advancing logically, but something was wrong. Step back, think about it. And I realized that all these wrong feelings started happening at the point where Isaac and Abraham get back together and start working together. So something in their dynamic was not working. Letting myself think on it a little more, which means no writing for a few days, just thinking. I was writing Abraham Gray wrong. Isaac's the easiest one for me to write because he's closest to me. I'm a retired sailor. I've been through that transition. Abraham Gray is a very different animal. He's still an NCIS agent. He's a much more taciturn man, not nearly as flamboyant or volatile or colorful as Isaac. That's one reason they work as a partnership and a friendship, because they complement each other. And I realized what was going wrong was there's a number of places in their interaction where I was writing Gray more like Shepard. That doesn't bother me. It doesn't surprise me I was doing this because, again, Isaac's the closest one to me. So it's easiest for me to write him. It's also easy for me as a writer to fall into the trap of writing everybody else through Isaac's eyes, which is not how real life works. Now, as our relationships change in real life, we all have one advantage, and that's we don't have to worry about anybody else but us. I can only write the story of my own life. You can only write the story of your own life. None of us can dictate, determine, or define the people around us. That's why friendships come and go. Some are here for a season and they fade into the past. Others are lifelong, and we treasure those very dearly. That's just life. Well, as writers, we have that same responsibility, but we have to do it from the perspective of every one of our characters as they relate to each other. And that is difficult. I'm not going to pull a punch. That's difficult, but difficult is not impossible. And when difficult is pulled off successfully, it's the best feeling in the world, especially when you're writing, because this is something that was difficult. You pulled it off and it lasts. It's a written story that can go forward for generations. If you're in the middle of a situation where you have characters whose relationship dynamics have changed and you're having trouble with that, first step back and look at the overall story. The first draft I ever did of Proud Lion, my first novel, I was a month into it, 4 weeks of writing, about 60 pages, and I threw it all away. The story was boring. It wasn't working. The whole story just didn't work. So I just kept the key elements that I needed and wrote a new story that worked. And that's the one you see published. But if you find the story is working, look at the characters. Take a moment and look at each of the characters carefully. Give yourself some time to think, but you might find that one or more of the characters is not reacting the way they should. If you let your mind get quiet, let that character talk to you, hear their voice. It could be just that simple, that because the relationship dynamic between these characters has changed, you're not comfortable writing that character yet because you don't quite know them. The same way that, like Jerry and I, we kind of had to get to know each other again on one level once we were both civilians, because the relationship dynamics that we depended on to define our relationships had passed with both of us retiring. It's the same thing with a fictional character. You're simply getting to know them in a new light, in a new situation. This can become a very enriching experience because you're going to discover things about this character that you never thought of. You're going to discover things about this character that nobody knew. That's called character growth. So if you're writing a story and the story's working, but something's off in a scene, and yet the scene overall is still working, take a step back. Give yourself time to think. Odds are one of your characters is out of character. That's what was happening to me. A number of times I realized I was writing Abraham Gray more like Isaac Shepard instead of Abraham Gray. I went back, and it wasn't a wholesale slash and burn, get rid of the scene. It was a surgical reconstruction. I rebuilt Abraham Gray's reactions, dialogue, and even thoughts to reflect him, and it all fell into place. It's an ongoing dynamic process, but that's what makes writing so challenging and so much fun, is it is a dynamic process. Even working with characters that we know in a new story means we're working with something new in those characters. A few weeks ago, I did a column called Keeping Characters Consistent, which I didn't intend to have a follow-up on, but this kind of actually follows that up. If you're interested in that one, I've linked that column below in the description along with my written column on this topic. So if you're interested in reading more about this, both those columns are below. If you think this video would help, I would ask you to hit that little like and the share button, especially for the writers. Feel free to share it. I would ask for your subscription. I do get something out every week, everything from the writer's craft to the waterfront to mental health to all kinds of stuff. If you didn't like this video but you stuck with it this long, I sincerely thank you. I hope you have a great weekend, and until we meet again, always go and do great things.